Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts podcast. So it's a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing growth, awareness, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, doctors, healers, etc. This information is not therapy or medical advice and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Brandi Herring. Brandi is a trauma-informed therapist who takes a holistic approach to healing that encompasses collaborative, integrative, and transformative interventions. Her approach is founded on evidence-based practices using a psychodynamic framework that incorporates the values of inner child work, mindfulness, personal development, and somatic healing. So, Brandi, welcome to the show. Thank you for being my guest.
Thanks for inviting me.
I'm so glad you decided to do this with me. Yeah, I'm excited as well. Just to get started, could you give a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to where and how you are today so the audience can get to know you better?
Yeah. So where do I start here? I grew up in Orlando, Florida originally, and I ended up going to UCF for college. I had a really big passion for dentistry. And I was going along doing, the dentistry stuff that needed to happen. And I started realizing or recognizing around me is a lot of anxiety, a lot of like feeling depressed, including myself. And so I ended up going to a therapist, and she was really good. Like I was benefiting from her as a therapist. However, when I talked to other people, they weren't finding good therapists. As I continued just kind of self-reflecting, doing discovery, I started to become way more interested in mental health, like the whole mental health aspect. And so it just came a time, like kind of a defining moment. There's this thing called the reflection pond at UCF, and I'm sitting at the reflection pond and I'm just like in between. It's like my last semester, and I'm like, am I wanting to do this? But I just knew I couldn't continue towards dentistry. I knew I had to explore mental health because I had such a passion for it. And also, I was experiencing it at the same time. So it just kind of pushed me there. So I made that decision. And then once I graduated, my minor was psychology. So I actually made it my major. So it was I was still graduating a little bit later, but not too much later. And then I ended up going to Barry here in Miami. And I got my master's in mental health counseling. It's such a good school. Like I loved it. And here I am.
Wow, that's quite a story, and I think a lot of people can relate to being in college or doing something and then having that aha moment where you realize that I want to do something different, or this isn't, necessarily what I'm passionate about anymore. So I think it was good that you were able to see that, and then, not just continue to do what you were doing just because.
Right. Yeah. And it was hard. It wasn't an easy decision. It was hard because when you're at that age, changing things up, you just want to kind of go and like do what you want to do. So I had to really sit there and accept like I'm making a pivot, like I'm changing things around. And am I wanting to do it? Am I wanting to start all over? So it wasn't an easy choice at all, but it was definitely worth it. I just followed my intuition, followed what I knew, and I went for it.
Yes. And if you were to be asked if you are happy with the decision that you made, would you be able to give a resounding yes?
Absolutely. It's brought me to things like this podcast, talking about my passion, spreading awareness. It's tapped into my creativity. So I learn a lot through the creativity of making content and doing all of those things. Um, And it's just cool to understand mental health and like behavior. And I'm just like a kind of a mental health nerd about it. But I don't think I made the wrong decision. I feel like if I was a dentist, I would be successful. And I don't know that I would thrive and blossom the way I'm doing it now. So I think it was definitely worth it.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and allowing us to know a little bit about you before we get started with the interview. But to get started with
Mm-hmm.
the interview, I want to ask some questions. And the first one is about self esteem because one of your therapeutic specialties is self esteem. So, what are some issues that you see with self esteem and how do you help your clients to overcome them?
Right. Yeah, I love this question. A lot of my clients, like you said, come in and they want to work on their self esteem. And self esteem really means like your belief in your own capabilities. Do you believe that you can do things? So, a lot of times when my clients come in and we work on self esteem, we're mostly working on reframing thoughts and also changing the behaviors at the same time. So, we start focusing on your thoughts and start helping you start to think clearly, like in a better way, essentially, reframing the negative thoughts, starting to do things to prove to yourself that you're capable. And that's also developing a relationship with yourself. So, you might have promised yourself you're going to work out every couple days. And like, if you continue to do that, despite I'm tired, despite this and that, you're starting to develop a relationship with yourself. It's like having a partner. Like, if they say they're going to do something, you expect them to do it. If not, it can be very disappointing. If it continues over time, it gets worse. It's the same with your relationship with yourself. So I think when you start reframing, which a lot of times you have to go backward too, it's not just in the present moment, you have to work on trauma. But when you start reframing and start challenging yourself to be able to do things and proving to yourself that you can do things, your self-esteem naturally goes higher, and then that spills into self-worth, which is, am I valuable? Yeah, you're valuable because I'm taking care of myself and doing what I need to do.
Love
So
that. So a lot of times when we have these self-esteem issues or self-worth issues or negative thoughts, some depression might be able to creep in there, right? So I wanted to ask, what is depression and how do you see it manifest itself in some of your clients and people you work with?
yeah, so I love this question too because it's depression is very broad. But overall, depression is characterized by a lack of interest, low mood, just general being down and low. A lot of times people think, you can't get out of bed in the day. However, when I'm working with clients, I'm noticing it manifests in different ways, right? It manifests as I'm going to be happy out in the world, but when I get home, I'm just not going to care. Like I can't get up, wash my dishes, do anything. But when you leave the house, you're dressed up, you look great. So it's that. It can be physical, right? Sometimes if you're feeling depressed, it's hard to eat or you overeat, you know? Another physical aspect of depression is sleeping. Sometimes when you're depressed, you either have lack of sleep or you oversleep, and then it's just the general, I can't get out of bed. I don't want to get out of bed. Like, and it's not like just a thought process. It's like an energy. It's like a pull. So that's why depression is the way it is, and it manifests in different ways.
Gotcha. Okay, that was a great explanation. Um,
Thanks.
so, with depression, with self esteem issues, a lot of that sometimes can be as a result of some inner child trauma that someone may be suffering, right? So, I wanted to ask, what is inner child trauma, inner child work, and shadow work, and how do they relate to the things that we've already discussed?
Right. Yeah. I get this question a lot because they tend to be intertwined. However, they do have some distinctions. For inner child work, you're focusing on trauma and you're looking back at past events, traumatic events, distressing events that had a significant effect on you that's also showing up today. So because it's showing up today, you kind of start digging in the past, trying to see what happened, and then we kind of see how it's manifesting today, and we think to ourselves, hey, like, how can I fulfill what I needed then? How could I, for example, if you were growing up in an abusive household, right, and you needed protection, how can I give that to myself? It might have manifested in anxiety. It might have manifested in anger. So then you have to start working on shadow, the parts of you don't like, the parts of you you're ashamed of, the parts of you that you keep from the world. So that's how they're kind of intertwined, but they're still distinctive. So that's the inner child work. With the shadow work, it's more of, like we just said, looking at different kind of behaviors and things that you aren't proud of and that you don't want to face. However, you can't get rid of your shadow. You have to turn around and look at the shadow if you want to grow and heal. And so once you do that and start bringing it out, it goes back to that like anger kind of thing, is like, oh, well, yeah, it goes back to anger where it's just like, how am I going to make this such that I'm no longer ashamed of it? I'm accepting that this is a part of me, and how can I use this in my life to live an effective life and live a life where I feel like I truly love and care for myself, and I appreciate the good and the bad. And with the bad, I can work on the bad. With the good, I can get even better with the good. So you just want to face it all. And then it's also intertwined, as you see, like you can get the data from the past, it comes here in the future, and then you start to work on the shadow work. So with that, I definitely tend to connect with my client to see where they're at with that. But that's how it normally works.
Okay. I think a lot of us may not have necessarily ever looked at the shadow as something that can be dealt with. It was always just something that was, well, that is just the way I am now because of what I've been through, or, those parts of me that they're just there. And like you said, some of us, we may hide them. Like you said, you'll go out during the day and you'll get all dressed up and put a smile on. And then as soon as you come home, you're a different person. And I think in order to get, in order to put those things like to rest for good, you have to, like you said, you have to look at the shadow. You can't run from them.
Absolutely.
Another thing you mentioned was trauma, and trauma is such a buzzword nowadays because everybody's talking about it. How would you define trauma?
So, trauma, I would define it as an experience that has occurred, a significant experience, distressing experience that has such a significant event on your life, it affects different aspects of your life from the outside and the inside. So, whenever you experience a traumatic event, you might be able to move on from the event physically, and also your body might be on 10 all the time. You might be anxious all the time. Physically, mentally, you might not think about this all the time, but you're acting out, you're doing things that you don't like to be doing. So trauma is literally like a big pool. It's a big pool. There's a lot of definitions, but ultimately it's something that affects you in a way that it doesn't come off of your mind. It doesn't really ever go away. It's manifesting in different ways. And people who might people can experience the same experience and not develop trauma from that, because it's a big pool. It depends on how you take in things in your environment. Are you more susceptible to trauma? Are you more resilient? It just depends. But ultimately, trauma is about a significantly distressing event that your body and mind was unable to cope with 100%. And so now you're in a state of fight or flight, essentially. Fight or flight, essentially.
I see. Okay. So as you start to work on your shadow and you acknowledge the trauma, and you're seeing that you may have some anxiety and depression and you want to get better, the more you start to peel back the layers, you start to get to what's called your core self, right? Now, are there some different dimensions to the self? I think there are five that you had on your website. Can you tell us what those five
Mm-hmm.
are?
Yeah, so the five dimensions of self consist of the spiritual sense of self, your emotional sense of self, your physical sense of self, your intellectual sense of self, and your, did I say social already? Social sense of self? Okay, well, yes, it's those five. Sometimes I like, we'll say it twice. Um,
No
it's those
worries.
five dimensions. And my approach, especially with my clients, I like to really meet them halfway. I like to meet them halfway and kind of start seeing what in their life matters to them. What in their life matters to them that gives them like purpose to go. And a lot of times it falls under one of these categories. And a lot of times that's what's missing, right? Because a lot of times when you're not doing so hot, you're not feeling well, you don't want to do these things. You don't want to do certain things. So, for example, the spiritual health is more about what kind of grounds you. What do you believe in? What can you come home to? Do you meditate? Do you have a religion? Do you have any kind of practices? That's the spiritual realm. The emotional realm kind of goes into that emotional intelligence kind of piece. How are you relating to your environment emotionally and your awareness about that? Not just with you, but also with people around you. For your physical dimension, it's about internal and external physical things. For example, internally, you might be eating really bad and you're not feeling well. And so you're not wanting to go work out and continue to carry on that physical, protection for yourself. And also, it can manifest in ways like, what am I watching on TV? What am I scrolling through on Instagram? So, you know, the physical aspect is not just outside, it's also inside, and it's about all of it kind of coming together. With the intellectual sense of self dimension, I feel like it's important because as we get older, we tend to kind of learn less. We kind of, we don't read books as often, we don't do things as often, and not everybody, but a lot of times it does get lost in translation. And so developing a more of a healthy intellectual sense of self is things like, okay, I'm coming to therapy. It's emotional and it's also intellectual because you're learning tools. You're learning skills about yourself. You're learning different things. It can be watching a YouTube video. It could be learning something on social media. It can be anything, a book, things that stimulate the mind. Because a lot of times today, we're so overstimulated by everything going on that it's hard to slow down. It's hard sometimes. So, whenever we talk about intellectual, that's normally what I'm talking about. And then the final one that I see a lot when I'm working with my clients too is like a lack is the social connection, the social dimension of self. Um, it's very important to have somebody, even if it's just one person, a sense of support. When we were hunters and gatherers back eons ago, we were in a pack. We always had to survive in a pack. And so now we live in a world where it's very individualized, especially in our culture, and it's easy to not leave the house. It's easy to kind of fall back. When you're feeling things like depression, things like that, you isolate. And also, it's very important to find that social connection, whether it's with a group of people, one person, social media, connecting with people that relate to you. So, that's how the five dimensions of self can be used in your life. And a lot of times, whenever I'm bringing somebody into therapy and we're kind of meeting in that point, we focus on how can we create a space for you to address what's missing and prove to yourself, back to the self-esteem, that you can do it. And then you can bring everything else together. So that's how the five dimensions of self.
Thank you. Now, something you just mentioned was when you're bringing your clients to therapy and they're coming into that space, that space, I believe, based on my experience, needs to be a very safe place in order for someone to be able to get comfortable with discussing their feelings and their emotions. So, how important is it to have a safe space, and what can that look like?
It's very important to have a safe space. Whenever I'm with a client, I like to create a safe environment so they can share, express, look inside. Having a non-judgmental environment where you feel like you're able to just let go for a second and get real for a second. So that can look like when the client comes into the office and, before we get into like actual like real psychotherapy, we kind of check in like, how are you? What have you been up to? Kind of meeting them there. In the middle of the session, throughout session, just listening. A lot of times people just don't even have people to listen to them. So just listening is a safe space. And then a lot of times, even at the end of my sessions, especially for working through trauma and stuff, you don't want the client to just leave with everything open and out. You want to kind of reel things back in. And I feel like that's also a form of safety because when you leave the house, you want to feel safe enough to come back. So if you leave the room after you've been working on trauma and you leave, you're like, oh my gosh, I feel like this, da 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 da. And you're not really grounded. It's like, is the therapist even working? It's all of these things. So creating that safe space, safe environment just throughout the entire session is important. Non-judgmental, meeting them halfway, staying present.
Gotcha. So with this safe space that's provided, right? Someone starts to be able to unload some of their emotional burden. Another question is it normal to feel a little uncomfortable in the absence of the stress and burden that you've been feeling?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is something we don't talk about enough because healing is great. And a lot of times it's not what it looks like. For example, like you said, you might go through a traumatic event. Okay. And now you're not really living in baseline. You're living above baseline. So you might be super heightened. You might be, hyper vigilant and you might have mood swings. And it's because sometimes like we're in such this state of stress for so long that without stress, it's like, what's going on? What's going on here? Like something's about to happen, something needs to happen. And so sometimes you actually put yourself into situations, even though you're healing, to make sure you get that feeling because the uncomfortable feeling is your comfortable space, even though it's uncomfortable. That is your space. So it's easy to just get bored, feel mundane, feel like, nothing is happening when really it's your hormones. Like there's this hormone called cortisol, um, trying to re-regulate itself, trying to kind of go down. Your nervous system's rebalancing, your cortisol levels is trying to level out. So it feels like nothing's happening and bored sometimes. And also that's really you just slowly healing.
I think it's wild that you can crave what your baseline was in the uncertainty or the stress, right? So as you start to heal, it feels off and you crave stress. That is always something that blows my mind. But if it's your normal, like you said, if it's your baseline, that's where you're going to want to be, and your body is going to feel off if it's not there.
Right. Yeah. It's so true. It's crazy how it works, but it's true. It's like a drug. You crave it, and now you're like weaning off of the drug, and so you have to readapt to a whole
Mm.
new space. And yeah, you just have to give yourself grace through that process because it can be challenging.
Okay, so as you're doing that and you're giving yourself grace in the process of weaning yourself off the stress drug and uncertainty, what are some ways to embrace your healing and feelings of uncertainty as you're, you know, starting your journey?
So what I'm realizing now is that one way to really start embracing that uncertainty is accepting that there will be uncertainty. A lot of times we're not thinking about that. When I'm working with clients, you know, in life, we just want to go, we want to heal, we want to feel better, you know? And also, there's a lot of things that we don't expect to happen, and it kind of either sets us back or anything like that. And so accepting that there is uncertainty and then being curious about the uncertainty, because then you're involved in your own process. It's like, okay, I know this is happening, and like, how do I work through this? How do I manage this? Even the question of embracing it, how do I embrace it? You have to meet the client halfway and start finding those things that can help them through these times of uncertainty.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense too. Um, so as we continue down this journey, right? We're making progress. We're peeling back the layers. We're doing all the things, and then as you start to heal, you almost become a different version of yourself, right? And if you're in a circle or an environment where you're the only one who's doing that work, you're going to be a different version of you with the same version of other people, whether it's family, whether it's work, or what have you. So it may be necessary now to readdress where you start and stop. So my next question I wanted to ask is, what is a boundary?
Yes, boundaries, boundaries. We hear about a lot about boundaries today. So, boundaries are about setting a limit between you and yourself or you and your environment. Literally, that's what it is. It's a limit. It's like having a little fence. You might not like your neighbor, but you need a little space for you, you know? And having that limit is a boundary. When if the person went and jumped over the yard, started playing in your yard, that's breaching your own limit. So that's what a boundary really is.
Okay.
Mhm.
So building off of that, one of your posts said, setting a boundary will inform you of how people feel about you. Holding a boundary will inform you of how people, wait a minute. Setting a boundary will inform people of how they feel about you. Holding a boundary will inform people of how you feel about you. Can you explain that?
Yeah. Um, so whenever we're setting boundaries with ourselves, it's very challenging. Um, a lot of times we don't want to set boundaries with other people because boundaries seem like not very fun. However, we have to do that sometimes. And when you tell somebody a boundary that you're trying to set, and they honor that boundary, it's showing you how they're feeling. They're respecting your boundary. If you tell them a boundary and they cross the boundary or they get upset about the boundary, you're learning the function of that relationship was okay until there was a boundary. So it really shows you who the person is and also how they feel about you. Now, when it comes to keeping that boundary, are you going to honor yourself and hold yourself accountable when that boundary is breached? Imagine this is one of your good friends and they breached a boundary that just is very dear to you, right? Are you going to hold that boundary, or are you going to go into it and be like, well, it's okay this one time? Like, it's okay, you know? So, are you treating yourself like an option? Are you treating yourself like you have boundaries, you know? So, when you hold the boundaries for yourself, you're taking accountability for yourself and you're taking care of yourself and you're showing yourself, this is how I feel about myself because I'm going to protect myself with this boundary. And so, yeah, that's what that meant.
Okay. Is it uncomfortable when you start to set boundaries? Can it feel off or can it feel like you're doing something wrong?
Absolutely. A lot of times it does. People around you might feel like it's very like contentious, like, get offended, especially with family. You set a little boundary, they're like, what? It can be very uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable. And also, it's when you set a boundary for yourself, especially a healthy boundary, over time you start to see the effects of not just how you're treating yourself, but how other people are treating you. Because the way you treat yourself is really teaching somebody how else to treat you, you know? So,
Mm,
yeah.
that's very true. So you mentioned that, okay, it can be uncomfortable, and people, if they start to cross your boundaries, you may get upset or you may get angry, and it could be a very valid reason to be angry. So my next question is about anger. Can anger be both constructive and destructive at the same time?
Yes. And this is a great question. Um, it can. Let's just think of anger as one entity. A lot of times underneath anger is fear. Okay? You have to develop a sense of awareness to see that. In a constructive way, once you become aware of your anger, you start maybe identifying there's a fear missing, there's something. What is my trigger? You learn that that anger is actually a sign of something. And then you use that as a means to either get over it, learn how to cope with it, do something with it that's constructive. When it comes to the destructive part, is like a lot of times it's a lack of awareness too. And you get angry and you just go off into the anger. You just let it out in whatever action, whatever you want to do, and it can be destructive in your life because you're not pausing, thinking like, what does this actually mean? Like, what really is this? You know? So that's how it can be like a friend or a foe.
I see. That makes sense too. Um,
Mhm.
I know a lot of times when people are beginning to set boundaries and there is some conflict, or people get their feelings hurt because of it, you may feel the need, or just out of habit you start to try and explain yourself, and then if your answer doesn't feel right, you start to over explain. What is over explaining, and where does it stem from?
So over explaining is taking a situation and just putting too much detail into the situation. Say you went to Publix and you went to go get an apple, right? You don't have to tell somebody, I walked into the door and then I saw a cat and then I picked up the red apple and I wanted the green apple instead. And because I wanted the green apple instead, I bought a handful of green apples. And then the whole thing is about the green apples, but really you went and got a red apple. Okay, so it's like you get to one thing and that's the hyper focus of it. It can come through ADHD, anxiety. It's basically you trying to feel some discomfort about what you're talking about. It can be just filling out space. Like it might be quiet for a second and then you you don't like silence. And so you might just start talking. Or, like I said, anxiety, ADHD is a big one because when you have ADHD and you start focusing, you hyper focus on this thing and it can sometimes manifest in that way. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So we've covered a lot, and I think that the questions that we went over were good questions that a lot of people may be seeking the answers to, right? But there's still that comfort component. There's still that aspect of needing to feel okay with someone, right? So if someone is listening and they want more for themselves and they want to do better, they want to work on their inner child, they want to face their shadow, all the things we talked about, right? But they're just not at the point yet where they're comfortable enough to see a therapist or a coach, or to talk to someone. What are some baby steps that they could take to get to a point where they may be able to open up and talk to a mental health professional?
Right. Yeah, this is a challenge and it's completely understandable. Talking to a stranger is very uncomfortable. And no matter what people say, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's just how it is. And so, some baby steps to take, especially when dealing with any kind of issue, is the awareness that there is an issue. So, that's even the first baby step. The awareness of, I have a problem and I don't feel comfortable talking to people about it. That's the first step. The second step is starting to accept discomfort. The whole process, not the whole process, a lot of the process is uncomfortable. So, getting to the place of accepting the discomfort is a baby step, is a step. There's things you can do in between. Yeah. You can do journaling, you can do meditations, you can do those things. And also, those are baby steps. So if you do decide to get help, you can tell the person, this is what I've been practicing, and this is what's been working for me in this situation, and this is what's not working for me in this situation. I always I always highly recommend, and I don't know, it's just because I'm a therapist, is making sure you find some kind of help when you are exploring your mental health, because having somebody to talk to you, somebody to reflect is important, because you cannot see the outside. You can only see what you can see. So acknowledgement, awareness, acceptance, and kind of moving yourself into that discomfort. I'm not even going to lie. When you work on trauma, you want to have somebody there to help you define what's really going on, you know, really kind of understand you better. Not everybody has access to therapy. Not everybody has access to a friend or whatever. One thing I think is really helpful, and maybe a lot of people are tired of hearing this, is journaling. Journaling will teach you a lot about yourself, especially if you're journaling with specific prompts. In fact, I have my own little paper that I give to my clients, and I think I'm just going to give that to you so you have for anybody who wants it. And it's just a bunch of prompts to help you get to know who you are. The more you know yourself, the more you are comfortable in discomfort. And that pushes yourself into, hey, I really know I need help and I want to find a way. Who can I talk to? Who can I run to? Like who? Somebody. But it's hard, and always give yourself grace. Always. Because it's difficult. It's a challenge.
That's really good advice. Really good advice. And I think that acknowledging the hard aspect of it is good, because a lot of us think, I remember when I started, I was like, I kept asking, when do I get better? Like, when does all this stuff go away, right? And it's not that it just goes away. You have to sit in the things that are bothering you, learn to get comfortable there, and then process them, and then go through it. So that was some really good
Yes.
advice.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. And it's worth it though. It's worth it at the end of the day to get through that, because you learn so much about yourself, who you are. It's a discovery process as well, discovering what you can do, like how far can I go? And so, yeah, it's, it's just a cool thing. That's why I love mental health. I'm like, it's just a cool thing.
Agree, it is for sure. Okay, so I want to ask you this, right? If you could use your platform to encourage someone who may be on the fence about therapy or mental health, or just talking to someone about their feelings, right? We already talked about the baby steps, but now this is someone who may never even consider it, but they have one opportunity to hear from someone in this shoe. What would you say?
I would say listen, read, listen, and learn. It's so important in life to have knowledge, even if you never go to therapy. Having knowledge about what things even look like, identifying different behaviors, doing stuff like that, because at the end of the day, this is your life. This is you have yourself in your life, and it's about figuring out what's the best process for me. What's the best way for me? And so if the best way is just not even to go to therapy, I always say stay curious, learn, read, find questions to ask yourself that just kind of brings out creativity. Because, like I said, I can understand how hard it can be to talk to a stranger. It is difficult at times, or even just sharing your problems in general. So, curiosity to me is like the seed, or one of the seeds to healing. So that's what I would tell them with my platform.
Great. Okay, so where can people find you online and social media if they want to follow you and learn more?
Yeah. So you can follow me on Instagram. It's Lucid Mental Wellness. I have a LinkedIn with all of my links. I have a TikTok. I have a Twitter. And I have a blog that's on my website, which is lucidmentalwellness.com. And you can access me. You can email me. Um, you can schedule appointments with me. And um, if you have questions or anything like that, for example, sometimes I'm on my Instagram and people will request specific content because, it's something they really want to see. If enough people ask me about that content, yeah, I'm going to create it. Like, I'm going to create it. So you can contact or connect with me through that too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this. It's been wonderful, super informative. I just want to thank you for your time and for what you do and the way you do it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is very exciting.